Brexit means Brexit.
An exit from Brexit.
No more Mr. Nice Guy.
Seamus, I'm not sure this is a great idea, is it?
Order!
Hello and welcome to Debated Podcast. I'm Conrad. I'm, as usual, joined by Will, my co-host, and we're going to be discussing all the latest political goings-on with today's guest, who is Daniel Sugarman, who is the a journalist for the Jewish Chronicle.
Hi.
So, before we get into the sort of political stuff, would you mind sort of saying a bit about yourself and sort of how you got into sort of journalism?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I guess I was like many other people who do an arts degree at university. I did history. I came out of that degree having no real idea what I wanted to do, as many people who do a history degree do. I mean,
as someone who does a biochemistry degree, I'm finding quite the same problem. So it's not just arts degrees.
Okay, well, I guess I'm glad to know we're not alone in history. I actually went to work for a marketing role for a financial company for a couple of years, and I mean it was good work, but it got to a point where I was really ready to find something new, and I'd actually been on Twitter, just as we do, and I saw a job advert for the Jewish Chronicle on Twitter. So I thought, okay, I might as well apply. And that was around 3 years ago. And I didn't have any journalism experience, as in I hadn't taken journalism as a degree, but I'd had a fair amount of experience writing, both in my marketing role and various blogging I'd done over the years. And I guess I gave a good enough account of myself. Interestingly enough, my last day in the job was also one of the most fraught, because it was, think about it, coming up to 3 years ago, June 2016, and it was for a financial company, and everyone assumed, okay, fine, Remain will win. And my last day in the job was a Friday, and the Brexit result came out on Thursday night. So obviously everything was absolutely manic in the office, and I went, okay, I'm going now. Good luck. But yes, it's been a fascinating 3 years.
So, obviously, since that has happened, there has been a lot of shenanigans over Brexit, and we've just seen the most recent result of that with the Conservative Party leadership contest, which is entering its final stage. What have been your thoughts as the campaign has gone on? Have you had any particular opinions about the candidates? What have you thought about the race in general?
The Tory leadership race, I think that Boris Johnson, frankly, would be a disaster as Prime Minister. I think he's muddled through every single job he's had with a mixture of fading charm, and I think that it would be terrible having him as our Prime Minister, because he would just try and bluff everything and try and pretend that he was doing a good job, and he won't. But on the other hand, I think that he's probably the better option when you consider Jeremy Hunt, who has to be, more so than Boris, one of the most hated people in British politics, considering his stint as health secretary. So I mean, really, between the devil and the deep blue sea, really. In terms of the other candidates, I think that a lot of people liked the sound of Rory Stewart, although people somehow seem to forget that he had pretty much a similar background to Boris, in that, we're talking about Eton and Oxbridge, and there never was a chance that he was going to get through to the final round. And yes, the other candidates, I actually thought Gove would edge it, so I was surprised to see Hunt just take it. But yes, I guess it will be Gove would have been much more interesting because obviously you've got that history after the referendum where the narrative would have it that Gove stabbed Boris in the back, and now we won't get an interesting kind of one-on-one debate where that's kind of the elephant in the room, but yes, it looks very much like Boris is going to be our next prime minister, unless Theresa May suddenly says, you know what, I'm not going to resign. If it's Boris or me, then it's better for the country if it's Boris. But we'll have to see. I don't know.
Talking about the sort of more on the sort of Tory leadership thing. Do you think that their sort of plans for Brexit, any of them had the right idea, or do you think that they're all barking up the wrong tree?
I don't think any of them really have that much of a plan for Brexit, other than shut our eyes and hope for the best. I think that it's looking increasingly likely that we're going to crash out with no deal, which is not, I mean, to put it lightly, is not ideal. I think that I don't even know how we got to this point, other than, I mean, say what you like about the referendum, fine, people made the decision, but from that point onwards, it seems like our politicians have consistently made bad decisions from all parties, and it's led us to this point. A deal, I'm personally, I've always been a Remainer. If there was another referendum, I would vote Remain again. But there were ways to get a Brexit which would have been less harmful to fewer people, and those opportunities were constantly ignored or passed up.
Obviously, you said that you'd be wanting to vote Remain in another referendum. Now, the Labour Party's position on Brexit seems to have been hopscotching all over the place at the moment. Do you think that this is a sign that politics is becoming even more fragmented when the two major parties seem to have such deep rifts over the biggest subject of the day? And if so, what do you think we're going to be seeing in the future? Are we going to see more fragmentation, so more splinter groups like Change UK, or do you think we're going to see perhaps the Liberal Democrats overtaking one of the two major parties?
I mean, there are lots of interesting scenarios. I think that despite Labour's constant calls for an election, they should be considering themselves remarkably lucky that they aren't in power right now, because if the Labour Party were in power, they wouldn't be able to do this constant fudge where one person says one thing, then they walk it back, then someone says something else. They'd be held to account much more, and I think that were Labour in power right now, we'd be hearing a lot of talk about the potential Labour rift rather than the Conservative one, because both parties are split on this issue. And I understand, obviously, why the focus is on the Conservative rift, because the Tories are in power. But yeah, Labour should be thanking their lucky stars they're not in right now.
Do you think that the rise of the Brexit Party in the European elections is sort of a harbinger of things to come, or do you think that was sort of a one-off protest vote?
It's a good question. I mean, there definitely was a protest vote element to it, I think. It's notable that the Brexit Party didn't carry Peterborough despite doing well in the European elections. I don't know whether when it comes down to a general election, people are going to look at that box and think, you know what, I don't really want to vote for what is, at the end of the day, claiming to be a single issue party. But I could be totally wrong. I mean, most people thought that in 2017 the Tories would win a significant majority, myself included. I think part of the reason many of us felt that is that we just couldn't comprehend that people, seeing all the stuff about Jeremy Corbyn, would nonetheless vote Labour, but they did. So I could be completely wrong, and perhaps people will vote for the Brexit Party, and perhaps Nigel Farage will finally get that seat in Parliament that he's failed to get for the last 7 times, is it? But,
yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Something like that. Personally, I hope not.
No, I think the Peterborough result was obviously a disappointment for the Brexit Party. as obviously it was one that they definitely hoped to win, and they did come quite close. There's been rumours about this all, postal vote stuff going on. I don't know if there's anything in that. I haven't looked properly into it, but I think that a lot of it, more votes would be down to the fact that the ground campaign for the Brexit Party didn't seem to be existent at all from what I've saw on social media, and that they just seem to, whereas Labour have built up years of activist data, all these things, and you can't really replicate that overnight. So I think that the longer the Brexit Party have to build to a general election, the better position they'll be in, assuming Brexit doesn't happen.
Yes, I think that's a fair assumption. I don't like the Brexit Party or agree with its politics, but I think even people that don't like it or agree with its politics can agree that they got off to a very strong start in terms of their ground operation. They were producing strong social media content, for example, strong videos, and that really resonated. Whereas, as you say, when it came to kind of pitch battle, so to speak, on the ground, they just weren't there yet. It depends how long they've got. I think you're right. The more time they have, probably the more beneficial this will be to them. Unless, of course, Boris somehow comes in and some of that Brexit Party support reverts back to the Tories.
Now, of course, one of the things that really marred the European elections, though obviously not to the degree that they didn't win substantially for the Brexit Party, were allegations of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia amongst candidates in the Brexit Party. Now, the Labour Party has obviously suffered similar things, particularly in Peterborough, with the comments that Lisa Forbes made. Do you think that there is a problem across parties with candidate selection, and that parties aren't looking closely enough at the candidates they're selecting if they have made horrific remarks?
Yes, I do think that none of the political parties out there yet have a real understanding as to how to do a proper investigation into the candidate in this social media age that we are in. I mean, we saw that with Change UK, didn't we? We saw Change UK announced their candidates, and within hours, a whole bunch of them were discovered to have said various things. I thought it was particularly hypocritical of various Labour supporters to be so gleeful of that, given all the stuff that's been going on in the Labour Party for however many years. But it does go to show that none of the parties seem to really have an idea. I don't know whether that's a generational thing. I don't know whether the people running the campaigns are older and therefore just don't get social media to that extent. I really don't know. Certainly it seems, I think now, a younger generation growing up now, let's say you've got a young teenager who's interested in politics and even thinks one day that they're going to have some sort of career in politics. They must have been looking at what's been going on in the last few years and realizing, God, I've got to be really careful what I say online. I've got to be really careful because stuff can come back to haunt you. But, a decade ago, who was thinking that? No teenager writing stuff, to friends or whatever on Facebook or Twitter was thinking anything of the sort. So I'd be interested to see what happens in the years to come.
Yeah, there's obviously like a sea change in terms of how political parties do view social media, and especially in terms of candidate selection, as we've been saying. I think that obviously not in terms of like racist kinds, but that also the idea of like in the future there'll be like drunk pictures and stuff that are going to come out, and people are obviously who want to go into a career now and very stage managed sort of Twitter feeds. But I do worry that there's going to be like no one interesting and fun in politics in future, because it will just be the kind of people who just completely stage managed, completely got their life set on it. Whereas if someone thinks about it later, they've already got this social media record. And I hopefully that it won't be seen as such an issue, but like, things like with the odd drunk picture and things, but I don't know what sort of the electorate of 2030, 2040 will think of that.
I that's assuming we're all around. Just to be incredibly morbid for a moment, that's assuming we're around in a few decades. But I think it's possible to be interesting and entertaining without being racist. Frankly.
Oh yeah, and I wasn't referring to like racist.
So I understand what you're saying. But I think part of a real issue is people want. For some reason, people want politicians, or increasingly seem to want politicians that entertain them, rather than politicians that might actually get stuff done. So Philip Hammond is quite grey in terms of personality. I think most people would agree. He's not a politician that, were he to have stood in the Tory leadership election, people would have really thought about voting for. I think, people. Increasingly, I'm hearing people say, well, and to be fair, they said this when he was elected London mayor. At least with Boris, we'll be entertained, or we'll have a bit of a laugh. But I mean, it's people's lives, so I'm not 100% sure that entertainment should be top of people's priorities. But I think it can be dangerous to have to base our political selections based on how entertaining someone is.
Now, just going back to the process that parties have with dealing with candidates or dealing with other internal matters. A couple of weeks ago, we had George Aylett on, who obviously is a Labour Party activist, and I asked him about the expulsion of Alistair Campbell from the Labour Party and how, why he thought it was so quick that Campbell was expelled, and yet obviously there are all these cases of anti-Semitism that haven't been dealt with, and he said that was because of the rules of the Labour Party, that it was easy to expel someone for saying that they voted for another party rather than in cases of anti-Semitism. Do you think that if the Labour Party at some point does really want to deal with anti-Semitism, that it has to change the mechanism by which it deals with it and perhaps change the Labour Party's rule book?
Definitely. I mean, I think that was I remember when, just a few weeks ago, Alistair Campbell was kicked out of Labour, and plenty of people were making the point. He said he voted Lib Dem, and you kicked him out within hours. We've got people who have been spewing the most vile anti-Semitism, and it's taken years, and you've done nothing. And you had Labour people saying, well, the rule book makes it a lot easier for us to throw out someone who says they voted for another party. In which case, the question is why. You've had years to change this rule book. It's not as if for the Corbynista idea has been, well, this was the case under the old regime, and we're bringing in these new comprehensive systems to improve things. It's rubbish. It's complete rubbish. They've had a lot of time now to do stuff. They've done absolutely nothing.
Do you think that obviously the problems laid with anti-Semitism? Do you think that the Tory Islamophobia is a equal problem, or do you think that there is what comparison can be made between the two?
That's an interesting question. I think that the problem of Tory Islamophobia is very real. I've seen a lot of evidence that shows it to be very real. I think that there's a tendency by some people, unfortunately, to try and dismiss it by saying, "Oh, this is just a way to kind of take attention away from Labour anti-Semitism." I think that's a terrible thing, because I all the time I see Corbynites saying, "Oh, there's no problem with Labour anti-Semitism, but look at Tory Islamophobia." And so when I see people saying, "Oh, there's no problem with Tory Islamophobia, but look at Labour anti-Semitism," I get very suspicious, because I see that as just the mirror image of what the Corbynites are doing. I've seen, unfortunately, horrific examples of Islamophobia from Tory activists, and increasing suggestions that the party has not done nearly enough to act on it. So I think that the Tories had an opportunity to show that they would deal with the situation differently from Labour, which has been failing to deal with it very publicly for years now, and they've been failing to do that, and it's another black mark against them, sadly.
Obviously, we've seen in the most recent leadership debate a great deal of controversy over anti-Semitic remarks made by people asking questions to Conservative leadership candidates, and the BBC were pilloried for not checking these people out and for checking social media profiles. Do you think that the problem of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia isn't just confined to politics, but there's a broader problem that needs to be addressed in Britain as a whole? And do media platforms, whether they be the BBC or other organisations, have to do more to tackle this?
I think media organisations definitely have to do more. In that particular instance with the BBC, and I think the gentleman's name was Abdullah Patel, it would have been quite tough for the BBC to have checked out his tweets, because as they pointed out, for some reason he reactivated his account after he had gone on the show, which meant that previously you couldn't search for his tweets, and so they wouldn't have been able to find them. So I think that's a fair explanation. I don't blame the BBC for that, but it's a problem generally in society. Yeah, we've got a problem with racism, we've got a problem with anti-Semitism, with Islamophobia, with homophobia, with all sorts of bigotry and hatred. And the reason we tend to see it in politics is because obviously our attention is much more focused on politics, because it's about who rules the country. So we tend to see it more in that climate. But I mean, I've been a victim of a lot of anti-Semitism in my life. Very little of it was to do with in a political sphere. It was walking down the street and someone would say something anti-Semitic, or that sort of thing. So it's a general problem in society, but we see it more in politics.
No, I definitely agree that that there is sort of problem with racism in society, and I think that sort of politics is obviously a mirror image of what we see in sort of everyday life, because obviously we like to think that politicians are completely different and separate class, and again in some aspects they do sort of seem to live in their own bubble, but they are sort of regular people as well, and so therefore sort of problems we see in politics will be sort of drawn from what we see in everyday society as well. But moving on to something slightly different, there was recently Stella Creasy, who's an MP pregnant, has talked about maternity in MPs and saying how female MPs have a big problem, they can't get maternity leave, and there's been a bit of a debate between her and Kemi Badenoch. What's your views on sort of the accessibility for women in Parliament, and specifically pregnant women?
Well, I haven't followed the specifics of the debate between Stella Creasy and Kemi Badenoch, so I don't know exactly what the two of them said to each other. But I do think that traditionally, and this has been the case for years, provision for female MPs has been absolutely dire in all sorts of ways. And I think it was Tulip Siddiq who pointed out, who basically dragged herself out of her maternity bed a few days before pregnancy to vote on something, on one of these important Brexit votes. I think it should tie into a new look at some sort of remote voting system, because I think that I know there are potentially pitfalls in a remote voting system, but I think that the benefits would outweigh those drawbacks. I think that could be a very useful thing for MPs who do get pregnant. I would completely agree with Stella Creasy that not enough is done in Parliament to make the lives of pregnant MPs as easy as possible, and I mean I'd welcome any steps that Parliament would take to improve that. I don't know what it would take, but any suggestions would I'd be very interested to hear myself.
Now, of course, there have been other issues in Parliament, particularly in the Parliamentary Labour Party, regarding the allegations against David Prescott and the perhaps insinuation that these allegations have been suppressed. Do you think that in politics there isn't enough being done to listen to people, particularly women, who report abuses in the workplace, in particular in Parliament, and that there should be a tougher mechanism to deal with these sorts of complaints and these sorts of issues?
I think there should definitely be something tougher in place to deal with these sorts of things. I think, for a start, that there should be an independent tribunal for all parties, rather than it being an in-house thing. Because the problem with in-house, and this is, you see this in politics, and I'm sure you will have seen yourselves, in some ways political parties can be remarkably like religions, and you'll get, and unfortunately you get this in all religions, this idea that you want to try and cover things up because you don't want to bring disgrace to either the religion or the political party. And we see that with anti-Semitism in Labour, and with Islamophobia in the Conservatives, and with abuse in both parties, sadly. I mean, David Prescott is certainly not the only instance within the Labour Party in the last few years of that sort of thing. And yes, I think the only real way to go forward is for there to be some sort of independent process, completely out of the control of the parties. Because, I mean, we've seen even recently this idea that people close to Jeremy Corbyn would be getting involved in various cases, stepping in and trying to influence the result, and that's absolutely toxic.
Well, we're coming to the end of the podcast now. It's been great to have you on. Just one last sort of slightly more light-hearted question. There's been recently a UK winner of the Euro Millions, 123 million, who is anonymous. Now, is this you? And if it is, or if it was, what would you spend that money on?
God, I really, really wish that was me. It's, as far as I know, it's not. Has the person come forward yet? Maybe it is me. I just haven't looked at the ticket. I don't know. I do play the lottery sometimes, but I'm assuming it's not me. Wow, if I had that sort of money, I think I would probably give about 20% of it to charity. Probably set up some sort of foundation to do that. I would also probably try and put some of it into local news, because having been a journalist in local news and seeing just how local news in the last couple of decades has been absolutely decimated, and the effect that's had on national media as well, I think that's something that's vital. I'd probably also take a very long holiday and finally try and write that novel that I'm constantly trying and failing to write.
Well, that's a very good answer. So yeah, thank you for joining us today. I'm sure we'd love to have you on again at some point.
Fantastic.
Thanks everyone for listening as well. If you want to get in contact, we're at Debated Podcast on Twitter. Also, we're on Facebook, or you can email thedebatedpodcast@gmail.com. So yeah, I'm sure we'll look forward to you listening to us next week.